All right, let's talk about something fascinating and honestly a little strange happening in Africa's tech scene right now. On one hand, you've got record breaking amounts of cash pouring in, but on the other, for most founders on the ground, it's never been harder to stay afloat. So let's start with the big, flashy number. Last year, tech startups across Africa raised a whopping $3.2 billion. Now, on the surface, that sounds incredible, right? It looks like the ecosystem is absolutely on fire. And it's not just a one-off. That's a 40% jump from the year before. I mean, that kind of growth suggests a tidal wave of investor confidence. It screams booming market. But this is where our story takes a turn. If there's so much money flooding the continent, why do you hear so many entrepreneurs saying that trying to raise funds feels, well, brutal? That's the big question we're going to unpack today. The answer, it turns out, is that the market has essentially split in two. We're not really looking at one big, healthy, growing ecosystem anymore. We're actually looking at two completely separate markets living side by side. And this chart really tells the whole story. See, the vast majority of that $3.2 billion went to just 69 companies in these huge mega deals. Meanwhile, you had about 500 other startups all fighting over much, much smaller checks. And here is the real kicker. While the total amount of money went up, the number of companies getting any funding at all stayed pretty much flat. At the same time, the number of people starting new companies has exploded. So you have way more founders all chasing the same small pool of early-stage checks. Yeah, welcome to the Hunger Games. So what's the deal? Why is this happening? To get it, we really have to follow the money and try to see things from an investor's point of view. Why are they putting all their eggs in so few baskets? Okay, first, a quick vocabulary lesson on a super important term, an exit. Basically, an exit is how investors get paid. It's their payday. It happens when a startup they funded either gets bought by a bigger company or it goes public. If there are no exits, that investor money is just stuck. And this slide, wow, it really lays the problem bare. In one recent year, the entire African continent had only about 30 tech exits. Now compare that to Southeast Asia, another emerging market, which had 83. That huge gap makes investors really, really cautious. And that caution creates this vicious cycle. See, because exits are so rare, investors get nervous. So they double down on the few companies that already look like they're succeeding, the proven winners. Those companies then get a ton of capital, allowing them to dominate the market and squeeze out all the smaller new startups. But look, the tough funding climate is only half the story. We also need to get real about the market itself. And that starts with debunking a really common myth about Africa's massive consumer base. Let's take Nigeria, for example. It's often called the giant of Africa. And when investors see a number like 230 million people, their eyes just light up. It looks like an absolute gold mine, a huge untapped market. But then reality hits. The average person there has only about $5 a day left over after they pay for essentials. So when your customer has to choose between your new app and, buying data for their phone, it's a pretty easy choice. That giant market suddenly feels a lot smaller. And unlike a place like India, Africa isn't one big unified market. It's 54, count them, 54 different countries. That means 54 different sets of laws, different currencies, different cultures. For a little startup trying to grow, that complexity is just a massive headache. So let's recap. You've got a brutal funding scene and a super complex market. But wait, there's more. The actual day-to-day challenge of just building a business in this environment, it's like playing a video game on the absolute hardest difficulty setting. I mean, just look at this number. In 2024, inflation in Nigeria hit almost 35%. What does that actually mean for a business? It means your customer's money is worth way less, almost overnight. The business model that made perfect sense last month is suddenly totally unaffordable for your customers today. And then there are the basics, things we might take for granted. We're talking about unreliable electricity, bad roads, spotty internet, and not even having formal addresses to deliver packages to. If you're running a logistics company, how do you even deal with that? These aren't small problems. They're huge hurdles you face every single day. And this brings us to a really telling piece of data. Look, everyone thinks startups fail because they run out of cash. And that's true for a lot of them, 38%. But an even bigger chunk, 42%, fail because it's just so incredibly difficult to operate and get things done in this environment. Okay, so
I know, the picture we've painted is pretty tough, but it's not hopeless. Not at all. This new reality just requires a completely different strategy. So, for the founders out there, what does the survival guide look like for the Great Squeeze?
The new rules are all about being resilient. First, bootstrap. That means making money from actual customers from day one, not just planning for your next funding round. Second, stay lean. No fancy offices. Third, solve a real, painful problem that people are desperate to pay to fix. Fourth, focus on being profitable, not just chasing some crazy valuation. And finally, think about teaming up. Merging with a competitor can be way smarter than just bleeding each other dry. So, what's the big takeaway here? The African tech scene is growing up. And, well, growing up is hard. The days of easy money are gone. But the opportunity? Oh, it's still very, very real. The winners in this new era aren't going to be the ones with the fanciest presentations. No way. They're going to be the tough, resilient builders who see all these challenges, who understand the real world they're in, and who have the grit to build something valuable anyway. The real question is, who's it going to be?